Welcome to my Mavuika guide. I'm gonna get into all the various things you need to know and how to best build her. And first, we're gonna kick things off with her skill. So Mavuika's skill has two modes. One of it occurs when you tap her skill, and you'll know this version of her skill is active when there's this pyro ring behind her. This mode of her skill will put her in the Night Soul Blessing state and will passively attack enemies around every 2 seconds. This attack even exists when Mavuika is switched off field, so she can be played as a sub DPS. Now, the pyro application of this attack isn't the greatest, yet it does have the nice feature of individually attacking enemies, so you don't have to worry about missing enemies with your attack as you would with other pyro units. The second version of her skill will have Mavuika ride her Flame Strider. When on the bike, Mavuika can attack enemies with special, normal, charged and plunging attacks, of which also deal pyro damage. These attacks allow her to be played as a main DPS, so I'm glad to see that Mavuika is very flexible in her roles. Real quick, whenever you want to switch between these two versions of her skill, simply tap her skill to do so, but back to her DPS, her ability to deal damage is furthered by her first Ascension talent, where when a party member triggers a Night Soul burst, her own attack will be buffed by 30%. So Mavuika is very much meant to deal damage, and especially high damage, as you will see with her burst. It is absolutely broken, but it is also a problematic burst as well. See, Mavuika's burst does not rely on energy, and if you're wondering, you heard me right. Instead, it relies on something called Fighting Spirit. Fighting Spirit is basically the same as energy, as whenever Mavuika has enough of it, she can then cast her burst. Mavuika needs at least 100 points of Fighting Spirit to be able to use her burst, but she can hold a max of 200 Fighting Spirit. The way in which Mavuika will gain Fighting Spirit is based upon the amount of Night Soul points your team consumes. So however many Night Soul points Mavuika and whatever other Natlan characters you have in your party consume, let's say it's 200, the 200 Night Soul points consumed by your team will likewise generate 200 points of Fighting Spirit for Mavuika to use. Mavuika on her own will gain about 80 points. 80 comes from her skill, so you then need to produce about 120 extra points of Fighting Spirit, and you'll work up to these 120 points by the other way of accruing Fighting Spirit, that being normal attacks. Normal attacks by anyone in your party will create Fighting Spirit, but unfortunately, normal attacks are gonna generate a very small amount of them. So small in fact that you really don't want to rely on normal attacks as the way for you to gain Fighting Spirit, and instead you should rely on the consumption of Night Soul points to fund Mavuika's burst. And whatever team you play her in, you should at the very least have another Natlan unit alongside her. But if you're trying to achieve the very best results, pairing her with 2 additional Natlan characters will be the best. Now, this is indeed very restrictive, and you may think just to gain the minimum amount of fighting points, but you actually don't want to do this. You want to gain as much Fighting Spirit points as possible, preferably the max amount of 200, as you'll see with her burst. One cast, Mavuika will fly in the air and deal an incredibly high damaging slash to enemies, of which is called the Sunfell Slice. This attack deals exceptional damage. It will easily one-shot most enemies, and the reason why it's so strong is because of the Fighting Spirit mechanic. This is the case as the more Fighting Spirit Mavuika has, the more damage her Sunfell Slice will deal, and this also occurs for her other Flame Strider attacks that we just went over with her skill. Therefore, whatever role you play Mavuika in, aim to create as much Fighting Spirit as possible. It's also worth mentioning that her burst will also cause her to enter the Crucible of Death and Life state, granting her interruption resistance and having her actions not consume any Night Soul points. The burst will also cause her to gain a set amount of Night Soul points, thus her need of Fighting Spirit is very slightly reduced. Now, if this wasn't enough incentive to play by the Fighting Spirit mechanic, her Ascension talent gives you another big reason to do so, whereby the damage of your active character is increased according to how much Fighting Spirit Mavuika used for her burst. This is another layer of brokenness that she brings to your team, as if you play Mavuika in a sub DPS role, she'll buff your DPS's damage by a significant amount, or if you use her as a DPS, this is yet another means to improve her damage. With all this in mind, when you're leveling up her abilities, prioritize both her skill and burst. Her skill is going to be the most frequent use of her attacks and will definitely make up a big portion of her damage, but equally as important is her burst. Her burst is going to be her main form of damage and something you'll either use before your DPS attacks or before Mavuika's big attack window occurs. As for her normals, I'd recommend that you just outright ignore them. Now let's talk about the best weapons to use on Mavuika. Coming in at number 1 is her signature, 1000 Blazing Suns, and this claymore is actually really broken. To put it simply, it gives the user really everything they'd want. It has a high base attack, it gives crit rate and crit damage, and then it gives even more attack for a long duration. To no surprise, it beats out every other claimer, but it also stands as a great weapon option for basically every other claimer character. After the Blazing Sun is the Beacon of the Reed Sea. This claimer option is a very good one because it's very similar to the Blazing Sun, both in stats and in performance. Other than the crit damage, this claimer gives everything the Blazing Sun gives, and best of all, its passive still applies when the user is off-field, which is not something that the other claimers I'll mention will do, so use this if you have it. But if you don't have it, the other crit rate claimers in the game are also quite strong on Mavuika, like the Verdict or Concierge's signature weapon. Though for the Verdict, while its passive is tied to Crystallize, this is actually a good thing since Mavuika does want to be played with Shallonen, so Crystallize will be performed anyways, but more on this later. Other than crit rate claimers, there's the Red Hornstone Thresher for more crit damage, and the huge crit damage this claimer gives keeps it as a top choice of Mavuika's despite the claimer's increase to defense. Next up comes the attack claimers like the Wolf Gravestone or the Unforged. As for 4 stars, there isn't many great claimers to use because of Mavuika's playstyle, that being to buff her skill, her normal attacks and so on, but there is still a number of strong options that even free-to-play players can use. The best 4-star claimer is the Battle Pass Serpent Spine. As always, it's a staple of 4-star claimers because of its crit rate and damage increase. Then comes the Milled Flower. This claimer came from an event a while ago, yet despite this, it is a very strong choice. It's basically the equivalent of an R5 range slasher, of which is a claimer you can use if you have it, but back to the flower, in some cases it's even better than the slasher because of its high EM stat. Plus, unlike the range slasher, it's not locked to Electro or Hydro teams, so this option will be really good if you're running a Mel team. Now for the craftables, there's the Tidal Shadow, which despite being craftable is actually a very good 4-star weapon. The attack and damage increase are very beneficial stats to have, and though the claimer's potential is locked to healing in order to be at its best, again, this isn't a bad thing considering you'll use Mavuika with Bennett or Shallonen. For those of you in early game, use the Blood Tainted Greatsword or the Debate Club. Next up, let's go over the best artifact sets you need to use. To kick things off, we need to talk about the Obsidian Codex. For Mavuika, the Codex is not a perfect set. For example, its 4-piece requires that the character consume a Night Soul point in order to trigger the 4 pieces buff. Yet, after her burst is cast, Mavuika won't consume any Night Soul points. She'll only consume them before her burst. This means that the Codex's buff will not occur for DPS's Mavuika's entire attack window, so some of her attacks won't be buffed. Then, the same thing occurs for sub-DPS Mavuika, because the 4-piece only triggers when the unit is on field, and of course sub-DPS Mavuika wants to be off field. Again, Mavuika is only going to have the Codex's buff for 6 seconds, but despite all this, the Codex still remains as her best set. Even though not all of her attacks will benefit from it, a good portion of her attacks will be buffed by it, such that the crit rate and likewise the huge crit damage the set will enable you to have will beat out all the other sets you can use on her. So whether you're building her as a DPS or a sub DPS, the Codex is the best. The next best set to use is the Crimson Witch set. It increases the reaction damage Mavuika will deal, in addition to her pyro damage, making it a strong option you can make use of. Very similar to the Crimson Witch is 4 Gilded Dreams. It'll give attack and EM to Mavuika, of which are important stats for her reaction damage and personal damage. Then strictly for DPS, Mavuika is Mehashose Hunter. The set plays very closely to that of the Codex, granting big crit rate for high crit damage, and as such it can actually be her second best DPS set, at the downside of being locked to Farina. So if you have Farina, this set can be very good, but if you don't, it falls off hard and you should just focus on the last 2 sets I went over. Further fueling the brokenness of Natlan sets is Cinder City. Overall, I'd only recommend to use Cinder City if you're playing Mavuika as a support, since for DPS there are better options, but even so, Mavuika's damage will still be quite good if you're using this set, yet her buffing potential will be insane. Not only will she buff your on-field character with damage based on her fighting spirit, she'll give them 40% elemental damage bonus and at the same time give herself 40% pyro damage bonus. Then there's also any 2 sets that increase pyro damage, attack, or even EM, and finally there's 4 Golden Troop. This may appear as an effective sub DPS artifact given its big emphasis on skill damage. However, Mavuika's burst makes up a big portion of her damage, so to not strengthen it will noticeably reduce her damage than the other sets. So though it's usable, I wouldn't recommend to use the 4 Golden Troop. Concerning those just starting out the game, you can mix and match the 2 pieces or outright use any 4 piece that buffs attack, crit rate, elemental mastery, or skill damage. On to main stats, in normal pyro fashion, you should use either an attack or elemental mastery sands. Both sands will be effective, but the best of the two will depend on what team you play Mavuika in, whether she'll be the one performing reactions, and how much of both the stats she already has. Equip a pyro damage goblet and then either crit rate or crit damage as the circlet. When you're leveling artifacts, aim for the substats of both crits, attack, and EM. Let's quickly go over Mavuika's constellations. Starting with her first, it increases her generation of fighting spirit by a nice amount, meaning that for one, she will gain more points and thus output more damage, and she'll also have less of a need of Natline characters, so she will be more flexible in her team. And then finally, she will gain a 40% attack increase. This is a really nice constellation to get, as is the case for her C2. Her C2 will increase her attack by 200 and reduce the enemy's defense, all while buffing her important abilities by a huge amount. As usual, a very nice damage increase follows from C2. Her C4 improves the passive talent Keon Gozi, so when Mavuika uses her burst, the damage buff will now remain constant instead of reducing, and it'll also give a 10% damage bonus. Last but not least is her C6. It will drastically improve both the versions of her skill. Her tab skill will now have the Flame Strider to attack enemies, and then when she's riding the Flame Strider, the Pyro Ring from her tab skill will appear and actually shred your opponent's defense while also damaging them. And then as a cherry on the top, her traversal with her bike is improved. As for my recommendations on these constellations, I really don't think you need them. She is already really effective at C0, but if you plan to get some constellations anyways, I recommend to either stop at C1 or at max, just get her C2 and then finish there. Finally, here are some great team comps to play Mavuika in. As a general rule of thumb, you can play her in any teams that require a pyro DPS and that have Natline characters in the team. For instance, a Vape team with Farina, Shilonen, and Benny. Shilonen in this team is huge. Not only will she fuel Farina's stacks and half for Cinder City, she creates a lot of fighting spirit for Mavuika in a very short time, making Mavuika deal higher damage and much easier to play. Yet its fighting spirit generation will not be perfect. In order to do so, you can replace Bennett with Auroron. For those of you lucky enough to pull Citlali, she can replace Farina in the Bennett iteration of this team, forming Mavuika's best team. Mavuika's damage will be massively improved thanks to Citlali's Pyro Shred and enabling of Mavuika to melt. Moving to support teams, Mavuika can be played for the most part in really any team that wants jungling, which is music to my ears because not gonna lie, I am tired of using her, but even so, Mavuika is also usable in teams that want a unit with Cinder City. Therefore, Mavuika works very nicely with Chaska, buffing the entire team and Chaska a huge amount. Mavuika is also exceptional in Moalani teams as her pyro application is perfect for her. Well everyone, this is my Mavuika guide. If you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing, and be sure to ask me any questions you have on her. Thanks for watching, and take care.